All right, I have started the recording, so I'm going to get going. Thank you guys very much for coming to my presentation, The Suffragette in My Family. And what I am excited about today is that this is the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote in the United States. And so what I've done for my presentation today is given a historical perspective of women's right to vote in the United States. It focuses a lot on Montana, and that is because that is where my great-great-grandmother, Mary Long Alderson, lived, and turns out was a suffragette. There are various things that talk about whether we should use the term suffragette or suffragist, and so it is correct to refer to her as a suffragette because she was a lobbyist and activist with regard to women's right to vote. Suffragettes supported people giving women the right to vote. It could be a man or a woman, but the suffragette itself was someone who was actively advocating. So we'll start out with my great-great-grandmother, Mary Long Alderson. So this is a photo of her that my brother-in-law or cousin brother-in-law had uploaded onto Ancestry.com, which is what got me interested in Mary Alderson. I, like a lot of people, did Ancestry.com and doing different family research and learning about different people in my family. And it was when I was doing that I found out that my great-great-grandmother had been a big mover and shaker in Montana and also on the national front for getting women the right to vote. But not necessarily the one that you hear a lot about when you look at the history, and I'll explain why that is as well. So my hope had been that when I was doing this, that I'd be able to go back and look at family photos and albums and sketchbooks. I have family in Oregon that have a lot of her old photos, family in California that have notes from her, and then she's from Montana, and even the Montana State University has a special collection dedicated to the Alderson family, and I'd hoped I'd be able to go there. But with COVID, I wasn't able to do that research that I hoped. And so I ended up doing this differently than I expected, but I think in a way that was really also interesting and insightful, which is I had to do a Google search. And that was when I found out I could actually do a Google search on my great-great-grandmother because she even has a Wikipedia page. I had no idea. So what I've done here is I did my research the way that someone would have to do if they weren't part of the family of Mary Long Alderson. And I've learned a lot about her, and I've given as many accounts that I can from biographies, but also able to look at it with a little bit more, I guess, of a family eye. So she was born June 19th, 1860. And so the first thing I thought would be is, so what was going on in 1860? Tell me where I am in history. So on April 3rd, 1860 is when the Pony Express began. June 19th, 1860, she was born Mary Elizabeth Long. On November 6th, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. December 30th, the states began to secede from the Union, and the following year, the Civil War begins. So that is what's going on as Mary is born. So I was kind of going, okay, this is all major things, and I got to look at this, and I went, but wait a minute, that's her childhood. So I'm going to talk about that childhood because I think it sets that foundation for her and who she is. But then we're going to talk a lot more about her as an adult. So she is my great-great-grandmother. Mary, her youngest daughter, Priscilla, had her oldest daughter, Margaret, who is my grandmother, and then Margaret's second oldest child and oldest son, Tim, is my dad. Mary's childhood, we're going to do 1860 to 1880. Mary was a Massachusetts native. She was born in Weymouth, Massachusetts. I learned that that is the second oldest town in Massachusetts. And many years before Mary was born, it was actually the home of Abigail Smith, the wife of John Adams, the second president of the United States. So where she was born obviously is a place that has historical significance for the United States. And it is also a town that was already very well established, already over 100 years old when she was born. I mean, a huge amount of history there prior to her being born. But then she was also part of an important part of history occurring at that time, which is because she was the child of Irish immigrants. Her parents were Eliza Reagan and John Long. I learned they were both born in Cork, Ireland, and that they had immigrated to the United States in Boston in 1851. So I did some research and said, okay, so why did they come? And it's most likely it is because of the Great Hunger or the Great Potato Famine. As I looked at the research, that would be exactly the time that people would be leaving. The crops didn't recover in Ireland until really 1852. So the timing is right for that being the reason that they left Ireland. And during that time, it's estimated 1 million people in Ireland perished and 1 million people emigrated from Ireland. So one of the things that I find interesting about the fact that she's the child of Irish immigrants is that my name, Megan, my middle name was Sheila. And so being Megan Sheila, I would often have people comment that, oh, Megan Sheila, you must be Irish. And I said, no, I'm not Irish at all. It's pure coincidence. My parents just like the names. And my parents told me we weren't Irish. And it turns out that my grandmother, Margaret, she had always told everybody, no, we're not Irish. And the reason she did that is because her mother told her that they were not Irish, and her mother told her. So it really comes down to Mary was very insistent that they were not Irish. And that persisted for many generations, that we believed that we were not Irish at all. And it is very likely that that was because of the violence and discrimination against the Irish during Mary's childhood. And you'll see that she did move to Montana from Massachusetts. And it seems very likely that at that time she decided that she was going to denounce being Irish in hopes of not having that held against her. I also thought it was interesting as I was looking at the Weymouth, Massachusetts, that in fact that Weymouth claims today to have the highest population of Irish ancestry in the country. According to the last census, about 39% of the city reported an Irish ancestry. And in 2019, they had their first annual Irish Heritage Festival. So I think it's safe to say that if she were here today, she would probably not feel the need to say she was not Irish. But the document over here is also John Long's declaration of his intent to become a U.S. citizen and denounce his Irish and English allegiances. Mary was an educated woman. She became a teacher in Massachusetts. And at the age of 27, she had resigned herself to being a spinster. And that was until she met Matthew Alderson. Matthew Alderson traveled from Montana to Boston. I don't know why, but he came to Boston. He had been married. His first wife had passed away, and he met Mary Alderson. The historical biographical accounts say it was love at first sight. And so they were married in, I believe it was September of 1888. At that time, Boston actually had a massive blizzard in December of 1888. So it's not clear if they left right away, but if they did not leave right away, most likely they stayed on in Boston until 1889, which is also when Mary's father passed away. But at that point, she was headed out to Montana with her new husband and became a settler in Montana. So I found this picture, which I loved. Mrs. Matthew W. Alderson was taken in 1889. According to the historical notes, this photograph was taken by Matthew Alderson, and it is at Yellowstone National Park. So this has to be early on in their marriage as she's getting to explore new parts of our country. So they ended up, and it's possible this was on their way to Bozeman, don't know. It was taken in Wyoming, according to the notes. But where they were moving was to Bozeman. Bozeman, Montana was founded in 1864 and incorporated in 1883. So it was a very, very new city. It was the county seat of Gallatin County, and the first newspaper was published in 1871 there, and that was the AVANT COURIER. And the Aldersons were an important part of Bozeman. Matthew Alderson is the son of William Alderson. He was one of the earliest pioneers in Gallen Valley in Montana, homesteaded right near Bozeman. And the historical information I found, he was also the local preacher. He performed the first wedding in Bozeman, and he and his sons were the owner of the Bozeman AVANT COURIER, that first newspaper in Bozeman. So they had a major role to play in Bozeman, Montana. They were a well-respected family, and so as Mary came there, she had a lot of opportunities due to this family that she was able to continue, as you'll see, with a lot of different causes that she cared about in Montana. Her husband, Matthew, ran mines in Montana, actually ran a number of different mining operations, including some down in South America in the early 1900s. And there are a lot of passenger records of him heading to South America around 1915. So the AVANT COURIER, the newspaper that the Aldersons owned, it was published in Bozeman. It became the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, according to the records I found. And according to the biographical information I found, Mary Alderson took on writing as a job and quickly established herself as a respected journalist. So she was among the few female members of the Montana Press Association and often wrote about women's issues and encouraged women among the newspaper's readership to become progressive. I read a lot of newspapers from Bozeman, including the AVANT COURIER. In doing this research, I couldn't find anything which gave nod to Alderson having written it, Mrs. Alderson having written it. And the AVANT COURIER itself, at least the dates I could find, actually didn't exist in 1889. It had ended earlier on, I think it was 1887. So I couldn't verify this biographical information, but it was said many places that she was a reporter, and obviously said she was a member of the Montana Press Association. So I think that information is out there. It just wasn't something I was able to find a lot of examples of. One of the other causes that Mary Alderson cared a great deal about was the rational dress movement. She's credited with having said, "Until a woman is allowed to have ankles, there is no hope for her brains." And the rational dress movement, she was a strong advocate of women not having to wear corsets and of them being able to have their skirts 5 inches higher so that they could walk. And that's not allowed to have ankles. So she felt that the movement on the rational dress front would also help women be able to convince the public that we could also use our brains and vote. In 1934, she wrote A History of Montana Women's Suffrage, and I thought it was just a very, very interesting to read what she wrote. In Montana, women been absolutely freed from the legal boundary imposed on her for centuries by the common law. The rational dress movement has dramatized in women's clothes the freedom for which she was struggling, and women today may wear anything they wish. It has been the dream of girls through the ages to be boys and do the things boys do. Nothing hinders them today. Yes, any girl at the present time may do anything any boy may do, and may wear a velvet chain or trousers. She is free. And so I really enjoyed this. This is something that she wrote in this historical account. And it also makes me smile because one of the things that my grandmother often would tell me about her childhood was that she had a very strong connection with her grandma, and that it was always really difficult because my grandma self-described that she always wanted to do the things that boys did. And so as I read this quote, I started to see more of a picture of how that relationship grew and why it was so special. My grandma was born in 1925, so I think perhaps some of her influence is also in that writing from her grandma at that time. So, women's right to vote. When did that happen? Well, Mary went with her family to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And the Chicago World's Fair had the Women's Hall, which is what's pictured here, and there was a women's convention with many speakers. And the biographies say that when Mary heard Susan B. Anthony speak at that World's Fair, that was a turning point for her, that she felt that women's suffrage was a cause that she needed to be part of. It was by no means the beginning of women's suffrage. Women's voting rights in America was an issue that had persisted for years, decades, but that was when she first became passionate about that cause. So a little bit of historical context. 1787, the U.S. Constitutional Convention decided that states would decide if women could vote. So at this time, many of the colonies did actually grant women certain rights to vote. But with this decision at the U.S. Constitutional Convention, at that point, New Jersey was the only state that continued to allow women to vote. So women lost quite a bit of voting rights with the U.S. Constitution being enacted. And then in 1808, I believe it was, might have been earlier than that, but I think it was 1808, New Jersey actually did away with women's rights to vote as well. So you've got that historical context, and then we move up to 1848 is when the Women's Right Convention in Seneca Falls was held. So that's when Susan B. Anthony starts becoming very well known for her advocacy of women's rights to vote, and you can see that still 12 years before Mary's even born. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was enacted. It prohibited denying the right to vote due to race, but not due to gender. This was viewed as a setback for women's suffrage advocates at the time. They had thought this was the perfect opportunity for this to be part of the Constitution. It was specifically not included. And so the women who were advocating for women's right to vote started going out to the states and doing independent advocacy in each state, trying to get the states, okay, well, we'll go one at a time to get women the right to vote. I believe it was 1870 that Washington State had allowed women the right to vote, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional. And so that particular case was the tipping point for women's suffrage that said the only way this is going to happen is if you get an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So that was a really important portion of that. And, you know, I didn't do a whole lot of historical research here, so I may have some of my timelines not quite accurate here, but this was the best I could come up with in what I was finding. So an important note is in 1889, Wyoming did have unrestricted voting rights for women and insisted that continued into statehood. But regardless, we were really not seeing that basically women's rights to vote were making any progress. At most, they were staying still or moving backwards. So 1889, what was going on? 1889 is when Mary is moving to Montana with her husband. This is important things were happening, frankly, for women's rights to vote. We've got the Eiffel Tower opening, Charlie Chaplin was born, Adolf Hitler was born, Thomas Edison showed his first motion picture, the US population was 43 million, and this is also when, on November 8th, Montana became a state, and November 11th, Washington became a state. So these important moments for these states are also important for women's rights to vote. The women's right to vote in Montana from 1889 to 1914, it started in 1889 because that was when Montana was trying to become a state. They had their constitutional convention. I believe it was July 4th through August 17th. But it was at July 17th was when the Montana Constitutional Convention decided that they would not include women's right to vote in their state constitution. And it was specifically noted that they believed that if they did include women's rights to vote, it might prevent them from becoming a state. Also, the Great Northern Railway was born in Montana. That concept, the railways were being built, but that was when the concept of that railway from Minneapolis, I believe, to Seattle was born. Montana became a state. And at this time, Montana was a leader in mining. They were mining copper, silver, and gold, also granite. And for the most part, I want to say they peaked in 1892 was the peak of Montana mining. That was when they were actually the largest miner in the United States. But at this point, they're like second to Colorado. So they're bringing a lot of money. They've got a lot of millionaires, a lot of millionaires, a lot of mining going on, a lot of building, a lot of growth, and their population is at 142,000. So a little bit about that Constitutional Convention. What happened was why July 17th was when that decision was made. The Fergus County delegate, Perry McAdow, was the husband of a successful businesswoman and feminist, Clara McAdow. And so she had championed the cause, and he recruited a longtime Massachusetts suffrage proponent, Henry Blackwell, to address the convention. Blackwell was an articulate orator. He made an impassioned plea, but he failed. And he said that was because he did not have the backing of a well-organized grassroots movement, and is quoted as saying, "There has never been a women's suffrage meeting held in Montana." Well, he didn't have to wait long. Basically, after 1889 was when we start to see that women's suffrage grassroots movement really happening in Montana. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of where we go on this. So 25 years until women get the right to vote in Montana. And Mary was there for quite a bit of that. So, she moves in 1889, 1890, her first daughter, Myrtle, is born. Her second daughter, Dorothy, was born in 1891. And then that 1893 is when she attends that women's convention at Chicago World's Fair. So about 4 years in is when she decides she's going to become part of that cause. She did so pretty quickly. There was one stop along the way, which I thought was really interesting as well. So she campaigned for the adoption of bitterroot as the state flower of Montana. And she is credited with being the reason that is the state flower of Montana, all of her advocacy and lobbying. So in 1895, she joined the Montana Women's Suffrage Association, and she attended the state convention. In 1896, she decides to join the Bozeman Women Christian Temperance Union. And what I found in my research is there's the Montana Women's Suffrage Association, there's the National Women's Suffrage Association, And then the Women Christian Temperance Union, which advocates alongside the Women's Suffrage Association continually through passage of that 19th Amendment. So the WCTU was actually a huge moving force in getting women's right to vote passed. And generally speaking, when you look at the history, Women's Suffrage Association did a lot of the protests, a lot of the rallies, a lot of the parades to try to influence. The Women's Christian Temperance Union did a lot of articles, a lot of writing, and a lot of neighborhood campaigns. So that it ends up being, that's a big part of her getting into that suffrage movement. So 1898, her third daughter Priscilla is born, so that's my great-grandmother. And then Mary really gets involved with this. She attends the Montana State Women's Christian Temperance Union Convention. In 1900, she is the speaker at that convention, and she is elected recording secretary. She holds positions with the WCTU basically for 35 years after that. She is the recording secretary for most of the rest of the time until women get the right to vote. And with that means she was in charge of keeping all their records. And I even went through and looked at their meeting notes for each of their conventions, and it was kind of amusing. One year she early on, she didn't come to one of the conventions, and they put somebody else in charge of being the recording secretary and elected her. And the next year it says that person had left the state, and they all decided to make Mary the recording secretary. And after that, even when she missed the convention, they still made her the recording secretary. So she must have done a very good job at this. So in 1902, and I'll go into this a little bit more, she helped Susan B. Anthony in writing the history of women's suffrage, and she's credited with writing the Montana chapter. And she is the assistant editor of the WCTU monthly paper. And she's then selected in 1910 to attend the National Convention for Women's Suffrage in Baltimore. And in 1911, she is somebody selected to stand next to Miss Rankin when she gives her congressional speech in Montana. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So she had she was right there with a lot of the stuff that was going on in this movement and keeping a pretty good record of what was happening. The women's suffrage movement in Montana was pretty active. Montana state legislature voted on equal suffrage during almost every session between 1895 and 1911. So that just tells you that those women and men who were suffragists, who were pushing this, they managed to get the ear of enough members of Montana Congress to put this in front of them every year. It passed in the House some years, not every year, but never in the Senate. So they weren't able to get the momentum they needed at that time, but it was there in almost every session. So Mary, what she was doing this time, here is an excerpt from that WCTU Voice, the monthly publication, shows Mary is an associate editor of that, as well as being that recording secretary listed there. In 1910, when she attends that conference in Baltimore, and I wasn't sure if it was the WCTU or the National Suffrage Association. I saw different mentions in different places, but I wasn't able to get any historical information on which conference it was, but it was the national conference. And what I did find out was while she was there, she met Louisa May Alcott. In her personal journals that are on part of the special collection in the Montana State University Library, she talks about having met Louisa May Alcott and how special that was to her. I thought that was a nice piece of history to learn about. 1911. So this is a really important moment. Rankin was born in Montana. She did advocacy, as many of you know, in the state of Washington, as well as New York and California, in support of women's suffrage. In 1910, she was helpful in getting women's right to vote in Washington. And after that success, she then returned to Montana to help with the cause of getting women the right to vote in Montana. So in 1911, she addressed Wyoming or Montana State Congress and urged support of women's suffrage. There were 3 women who stood with her while she made this speech, and there was 2 physicians, 2 female physicians, and then Mary Long Alderson was the other person. This speech is considered by many a turning point for women's suffrage in Montana. However, I'm not sure that Mary Alderson thought so. She wrote regarding this speech, "They gave her the violets, but not the votes we desired." So I don't think she was satisfied with the outcome there, but she was part of that. And after that 1911 session, the movements, the suffrage movement in Montana did something very creative. They convinced both the Democratic and the Republican parties to each put equal suffrage into their platforms. So during those 1912 campaigns for all of the Montana state legislators, both sides were saying, we're going to get equal suffrage passed. So in 1913, that's what they did. In January 1913, they passed the bill by large majorities, 26-2 in the Senate and 74-2 in the House, because they had convinced both sides that this was their issue. So all that was left was for the popular vote to approve this amendment to the Montana State Constitution. And that was the next thing that needed to happen. And so what the suffragettes did was they started campaigning. They started campaigning locally. And this is where you see that WCTU. They had over 1,500 members and 50 chapters in Montana at that time. And they ran their own campaign in support of women's right to vote and getting Montana to approve that constitutional amendment. The state president at that time, Mary Alderson Long of Bozeman, traveled 4,500 miles and effectively mobilized her members to engage in neighbor-to-neighbor campaigns. Some of the campaign methods that were used, according to Mary in her history of women's suffrage in Montana, there were meetings, parades, headquarters, distribution of literature and speakers. They raised money, arranged speakers, wrote pamphlets. And it was the Women's Christian Temperance Unit. They believed that prohibition and women's right to vote were hand in hand. And so Mary Alderson did say there was little opposition, but much quiet work by the liquor interests. So she still felt there was a battle being fought. I mean, you can see over here to the side some of the maps that were used in the pamphlets that were distributed to local communities. And another thing that was done was a lot of advertisements. They had a newspaper, the Suffrage Daily News, and they would have articles. And I did find a lot of these, and they're really fun to read. These old newspapers that are just entirely filled with persuasive writings on why women should have the right to vote. And included in that was this advertisement that women's suffrage, the only constitutional amendment to be voted on November 3rd, vote yes because taxation without representation is tyranny. All governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The home demands it and the worker needs it. And so these were some of the ways that they did persuade the people of Montana to approve women's right to vote in Montana. And pictured here this isn't actually when Montana did it, but this is the suffrage flag, and they would add a star for every state as they were moving towards the right to vote. So just kind of a fun part. But what Mary wrote in her historical account of Montana approving women's right to vote was the long struggle of over 70 years for the political emancipation of women, to which Susan B. Anthony and other women and men had practically devoted their lives to educate people to the justice of giving women the ballot, was over for the state. She was obviously very happy with the outcome, which meant that once Montana had approved it, they moved on to the national stage. Much like other states, when women's right to vote was approved, they moved to the national and said, how are we going to get this for the nation? And Montana was part of that as well. In 1916, Montana elected the first woman elected to Congress. That was Miss Jeanette Rankin from Montana. And pictured here is her first address to Congress after she was elected. And I thought this was kind of interesting and fun. It wasn't just advocacy in Congress. There were actually a lot of protests that were held, and this is a photograph from the War Department of suffragettes, bonfire, and posters at the White House in Washington, D.C. in 1917. There was another photo, didn't come out quite as well, so I didn't include it, but it's a group of regular Americans protesting outside of the White House. So there's a long history of those protests to express the desire to see changes in our government. So what happened, the 19th Amendment, it was approved by the House in May of 1919. Montana ratified that in August of 1919. And but what was needed in order for it to actually become approved and ratified to amend the Constitution was 3/4 approval. And that brings us to today and why today is such a special day. So on August 18th, 1920, Tennessee ratified that amendment, and that was the 36th ratification. And so that was our 3/4 approval necessary to ratify the 19th Amendment. But what I learned that I thought was interesting, so it's credited as being the result of a change of vote by a 24-year-old legislator, Harry Byrne, at the insistence of his elderly mother. But those against the amendment managed to delay official ratification. Anti-suffrage legislators fled the state to avoid a quorum. Their associates held massive anti-suffrage rallies and attempted to convince pro-suffrage legislators to oppose ratification. And so even though the votes had been cast on August 18th of 1920, it wasn't until the 24th day of August that the governor ratified or certified those election results that the 19th Amendment had been approved. So what I learned is my great-great-grandmother did a lot to help preserve this history. And I think that is what I was able to find the most evidence of, although there's certainly a lot of biographies that say that she did a lot more than she gave herself credit for. But what I could find, what she did do, and the reason I could find it is because of her, was compilations. That History of Women's Suffrage by Susan B. Anthony. It's 4 volumes, and volume 4, chapter L, titled Montana, the footnote says, "The history is indebted for this chapter to Mrs. Mary Long Alderson of Helena, one of the first officers of the State Women's Suffrage Association." And then I was able to find this letter dated December 25th, 1902. It's from Susan B. Anthony. "My dear Mrs. Alderson, in recognition for your very kind and efficient assistance in the preparation of Volume 4 of the History of Women's Suffrage, I take pleasure in presenting it to you. Affectionately yours, Susan B. Anthony." And there's a second letter that came the following year on March 10th, 1903, which partially is just interesting. My dear friend, I'm sending you by express today the long-promised copy of Volume 4 of the History of Women's Suffrage. The delay was caused by a fire in the bindery department of the publisher. So apparently the book did not come with that first letter. However, something I thought that was particularly special, and especially for this group, is the letter then says, "I trust the book will reach you safely and you will derive as much pleasure from the study of its contents as I do in presenting it to you, and that you will use every possible effort to have a copy of it placed in your public library. With best wishes for you always, I am sincerely yours, Susan B. Anthony." In addition to helping with this, later on, Mary wrote the historical sketch of the Montana Women's Christian Temperance Union, and you see in it at the beginning, it says, "For many years it's been the hope of our Montana Women's Christian Temperance Union that information in regard to its meetings and its various efforts and achievements might be gathered and recorded in brief form so that some authentic record of the organization might be available for members, schools, libraries, and general readers." And this is a book that I was able to get on digital form and read through, and that's where I was able to see the history of her involvement as the recording secretary and the decision to send her to the national conventions. And so it was a useful historical record that I utilized in doing my research as well. And I'm very grateful for her having authored that with Reverend Hogue. She also has a lot of unpublished works, and they are at the Montana State University Library. But she wrote the Montana Laws Relating to Temperance and Public Morals, 34 Years in the Montana Women's Christian Temperance Union, 1896 to 1920, the Montana State Floral Emblem Campaign of 1894, and she compiled a press clipping scrapbook as well. So she's done a lot to preserve that history, and those are still resources that are cited in so many of the things that I was reading about Montana history. The very first thing they cite are the writings of Mary Alderson. So I also just wanted to include a little bit about that Montana state flower, that the WCTU had adopted the bitterroot as its flower in 1891. They sent it with Alderson as Montana's representative to the World Columbian Expedition, and she came home determined to have the state flower. So that's where she formed that Montana State Floral Emblem Society and single-handedly formed committees on the county and community level. There was a statewide election for the state flower, and she used the newspapers listing the virtues of the favorite flower, and then they had the legislature adopted the bill, and the state flower was adopted, and it is credited with being thanks to Mary Alderson. And so in closing, she did pass away January 7th, 1940, and her obituary stated that she was a prominent state feminist and perhaps Montana's foremost woman lobbyist at the state capitol for more than 20 years. And that I wanted to include because that's one of the only mentions of her lobbying at the state capitol for more than 20 years. And I believe that's part of the reason that, I don't have a lot of pictures of her. I don't have a lot of documents of her out rallying the crowds, because she was at the state capitol and she was lobbying the legislators to get changes made. And if you want to learn more, the Washington State Historical Society is doing a centennial celebration, and they're doing whistle stops, and their final stop is going to be in Olympia on August 26th. And you can learn more about the suffragettes and the suffragist movement.